Hey there folks, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox, aka the #1 McCoy Tyner fan, here with another quick album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new ill-considered record, Precipice. While ill-considered have always been a force to be reckoned with within their own little realm in the world of avant-garde jazz, it was when they released Liminal Space in 2021 that it felt like they really defined themselves as one of the most critically beloved jazz bands out there, and more than that, it was with that record that the collective proved that they could be one of the most boundary-pushing avant-garde jazz acts out there at the moment to have debuted in recent years, thus making them one of the most important jazz artists to really keep an eye on. Liminal Space is a brilliant album, highly recommended, one of the best jazz albums to come out throughout the entire decade so far. But more than that, it defined what I would consider to be some of the most fresh sounds that we've seen from the entire genre in the past 5 or so years, which is why I think it's a shame that despite Precipice being a good album, is a not great follow-up to what is a near masterpiece territory record. For a decent enough jazz comparison, this would kind of be like if Charles Mingus followed up Let My Children Hear Music with an 80s era Miles Davis album. It's not bad at all. In fact, it's actually pretty decent. It's just in comparison to what came before it, this doesn't feel like much. The main flaw that you will find in Precipice is that it seemingly is less willing to be adventurous than its predecessor record, Liminal Space, or even albums that came before Liminal Space, if I'm being completely honest. I mean, it feels like it's an intentional feature throughout this record to kind of switch things up from the records that predate it, but at the same time, I feel like maybe that wasn't the best direction to go in, as the deep levels of traditionalism, or about as traditional as avant-garde jazz gets, here are not really something that make this record stand out to me. That being said, I do think that the focus on taking things in maybe a bit more of a dialed-back direction at least allows some of the individual performers to shine here, and for that I can say that's at least one positive attribute about this record, among actually a few if I'm being completely real. Idris Rahman is really the primary standout performer here. I mean, he's one of the definitive contemporary saxophonists within the realm of experimental jazz, and that doesn't really change here at all. His performance work is still as energetic, as frantic, as daring as ever, and any moments on this record that do show to be maybe a little bit more on the explorative side, generally speaking, come from his performance work alone, with him really carrying a lot of the, again, more experimental, adventurous qualities that you do occasionally find on this record, though not constantly like some of the better ill-considered albums out there. But even with that being said, I do feel like Idris Rahman does kind of maybe go a little bit too off the rails here. I feel like his performance would work much better if the rest of the band followed in suit of pure exploration throughout this record, just complete and total adventurousness. But although I do think his work here is admirable from the perspective of him exploring his instrument, exploring the sort of auditory space that's provided on the record, I kind of feel like he's a bit out of place here almost, with the rest of Ill-Considered not feeling nearly as daring in terms of performance work. I mean, the rest of the band do have their moments to shine, occasionally, sure, but they kind of end up being few and far between, with tracks like Solenopsis and Linus with the Sick Burn really being the only moments where there are passages that highlight the bass work or the percussion work here, and that's not even to say the whole songs really kill it in that regard. It's just specific moments here or there that let members of Ill-Considered shine for just a brief moment before going back into a less memorable and less distinct form of avant-garde jazz. I'm not saying that Precipice is performed poorly or anything like that. In fact, it's actually performed very well, and I think that from an instrumental standpoint, this record, at least to an extent, sounds as solid as Ill-Considered ever have. But with that in mind, I feel like there's a lack of creative direction or just outright purpose here on this record for anything to really stick. I mean, between Liminal Space and all of Ill-Considered's self-titled records, their self-titled series of albums that predate the aforementioned Liminal Space, I feel like almost all of those records, if not all of those records, have at least some degree of connection between tracks, some degree of creative direction, not necessarily a consistent concept, but at least a singular creative mindset that really set them apart from a lot of other jazz out there to make them records that stand up on their own, that feel memorable, that feel distinct from one another while still belonging to the same collective. etc., etc. Whereas I feel like here on Precipice, it's an album that's made up of some great performers doing some strong instrumental work that doesn't really blend together super well or have a direction that allows them to really shine in a way that feels memorable. Even after multiple listens of this album, I don't walk away from it thinking, man, that one segment just went really crazy, or like, wow, I really love the bass on that passage right there. And for what it's worth, maybe that's the intent. This does feel like a less grand album in comparison to some of the things that Ill Considered have put out in the past, but I don't know if that's really for the better exactly. All I mean to say is that I don't think this record has the really strong, anchored direction that some of their prior works do. I don't necessarily think it has the same contagious energy that some of their prior works do. And with that, all that's really left is a group of performers that happen to be beyond competent, really keeping this album together and preventing it from genuinely failing. That's not to say this album is close to being bad. It's not. It's just that I feel like this is the closest that Ill Considered have ever been to being weak. Look, Precipice is an album filled with solid performances, and it likely will still appeal to a lot of fans of abstract avant-garde jazz out there. Hell, it kind of appeals to me, because I am a fan of abstract avant-garde jazz. But I still do think that it's kind of a shame that Ill Considered's latest effort doesn't feel as bold as some of their past works. In fact, I would actually say that this is some of the most tame material that they put out to date. And while they could have morphed that concept into a more successful record, maybe a more atmospheric album, it kind of feels like they don't really manage to achieve much of anything besides showing off some of their instrumental chops now and again. Even still, solid album, enjoyable. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that's the end of this quick album review. I've been Zay from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.